Hello and welcome to Newspeak. I'm Peter Whittle, and as usual, pleased to say I'm joined by Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, our Senior Fellow Royal Historian, and Amy Gallagher, the campaigner behind Stand Up to Woke. Now, before we go on to talk about this week's issues, just a couple of notices for this upcoming week. On June the 25th, that's this coming Tuesday, we have two events. One of them is in Wellingborough. It's a special election event, and the speaker would be Ben Habib, the Deputy Leader of Reform. That's on this Tuesday in Wellingborough. And on the same night, in Newcastle, there will be a locals event in Newcastle. And Rafe, you're going to be speaking there? Rafe will be speaking there in Newcastle. Best thing to do if you want to come to either of those events is to go and write to locals@newcultureforum.org.uk, and then we can give you the details. And they're great events, and obviously, particularly at the moment with the election, will be particularly good. So hope to see you at one or other of those. Election, 2 weeks, I think it is now to go. Wanted to talk today about two connected things, really, and they're about the sort of unseen, unreported side of the election. And one is to do with basically what Labour plans to do, and the other is actually about what's happening during the election. Starting, Rafe, with basically what one can only describe as this rise of sectarianism that we're seeing, and across basically the country, and it's not really being reported, is it?
That's right. It's not being reported very much at all, and there's few publications where it has been reported, places like The Telegraph and The Spectator. It's almost as if they've just discovered that sectarianism is a problem in this country. Yeah. For example, we've had new polling out by Whitestone Insight that finds that 35%, this is quite remarkable, 35% of youth aged 18 to 25 say that religion is going to influence how they vote. Yeah. Compared to only 15% of those over 55. Now, of course, people who are of the faith will say, oh, that's a wonderful thing, until, of course, you realize that youth demographic aren't Christian. They're actually, they're adherents to another faith, primarily, and although not exclusively. And yet this is being reported as if it's, an epiphany people are having that this is a problem that we're facing. This has been on the cards for a long time. We've known for 20 years that Islamic youth hold far more radical beliefs and far more religious beliefs than their parents or grandparents. Yeah. So this notion that integration is inevitable after one or two generations is clearly for the birds and not working. And of course, it's increasingly creating in our societies religious silos. And it's going to be seen at this election for the first time in a really strong way. But of course, it's only going to get worse as the decades go on. We've seen this being used to great effect by people like George Gallagher, who have used the whole issue of Gaza as a way to entice the Muslim vote to him. And of course, there is also now this organization called the Muslim Vote, which is quite blatant in stating that it represents the 4 million Muslims as if they are one homogeneous bloc incapable of independent thinking or having disparate views, and it says that it wants to fight for those cases. And we also have situations, for example, where we have independent candidates who quite openly state that they don't care about education, they don't care about healthcare, all they care about is Palestine. And of course, as your MP, you're supposed to represent all peoples, irrespective of race, creed, or colour, or gender, or anything else. And yet here we clearly see that these are one-issue candidates who are gaining significant votes in areas with a very large, demographic from one particular region.
There was, in fact, I think there is a candidate in Slough, which is next door to where I am, who indeed said something along those lines, that this is not about education, I don't really care, it's actually about Gaza. I mean, there's another, it's not quite the same, but sort of the same, Amy. The fellow who is standing, against Nigel for Labour, has also said this is a vote for every black and brown person in the country. He's a black guy for Labour. Yeah. And it's it's being accepted, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just totally accepted now that you vote along kind of religious or identity lines.
Yeah.
I mean, it's quite a racist statement to say, not just racist towards white people, because he's essentially saying that he doesn't care about white people's votes, but he's just essentially saying, because I'm black, I expect black people to vote for me. It doesn't seem to be advocating for any particular policy, just assuming that because of his colour, the colour of his skin, that other people that look like him will vote for him. But we're seeing, I think this is what happens with multiculturalism, that when you have too many different identities, too many value systems, too many kind of viewpoints, essentially what happens is everybody just votes along their tribal lines.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a rise of sectarianism, not just in response to the rise of Islamism and Islam sectarianism. We're seeing the rise of kind of Sikh and Hindu kind of sectarianism, which is perfectly understandable, because Labour essentially are really elevating Muslims and Islam, with their introduction of this Islamophobia guidelines and so on, and they are neglecting the other religions. So Hindus are now calling for an anti-Hindu hate crime law, which is, is more of the same, but you can understand why they're doing it, because there is a tension between Muslims and Hindus. There was kind of sectarian violence on the streets of Leicester only a couple of years ago. So it makes sense that these other groups will then say, well, I want a kind of legislation for my particular group, and then what we end up with is not a democracy but just warring tribes of everyone against everyone, and all essentially the person that will win out is just demographics, who has the most numbers. And we know that Islam is the religion that is rising and having lots of children and so on.
Yeah, it's with you mentioned the Hindu there. I believe that actually one Hindu group has managed to get an MP to sort of sign a kind of pledge that, I think she will, look after their interests, basically, is what it amounts to, which sort of bears out your point, doesn't it, really, that it's not just Islam. I mean, that essentially, I remember during the London riots in 2011, after the London riots, there was this sort of way in which different communities came out, to protect their turf, and this was looked on as being a great thing. It's like everyone saying the wonderful Turks, of North London, looking after their property, and Sikhs and such like. Obviously, the only group that was considered to be beyond the pale were groups of white, usually young men, immediately fascist, This is only the beginning, isn't it?
Yeah, we're seeing clearly an increase in currying favour, no pun intended, with candidates who are essentially looking to do whatever is possible to secure a vote. And so we've seen Marco Longhi, the candidate for Dudley, who has put out leaflets in highlighting the Hindu name of his Labour candidate in order to entice Muslim votes to come over. We're seeing clearly efforts made by the Labour Party more generally. We saw this ridiculous, cringe-worthy video of Keir Starmer and Sadiq Khan talking about Islam. I mean, it was the sort of stuff that you would ask in a bad AI video to create something like this. Clearly done because, Labour's worried about Muslims leaving Labour over the Gaza issue. And so now they're bending over backwards to try to entice that vote back. The whole purpose of this is the unintended consequences of mass immigration that Labour didn't actually foresee, although it was quite obvious what was going to happen. They wanted people to come over because, as I've said 1,000 times, 70 to 80% of ethnic minorities vote Labour, or at least used to vote Labour. But now that they're getting to such a critical mass, their religious identities and their ethnic identities trump their loyalty to the Labour Party. And so now we're seeing Labour being torn asunder with all of these competing interests from different factions, different races, different religions within that Labour umbrella. And it's going to, I think, become quite a challenge for the Labour Party to be able to appease all of these different groups, many of whom have competing interests.
Also, the Commons is going to look quite different after this election, isn't it? If you think about it. I mean, I would have thought as well there are going to be many more diverse candidates than there's ever been on the Labour bench.
On the Labour bench, yeah.
But do you think as well do you think it will lead to a rise in sectarian feeling amongst the white British?
Well, we've seen that. I mean, the recent rally, didn't we, with Tommy Robinson that happened in London. There was actually for the first, I'd never seen it before, but people expressing kind of quite strong Christian sentiment. And I hadn't seen that that so much before in a kind of in a right-leaning protest. So it may well be that people start claiming, Christian, wanting to have Christian representation. I mean, that seems to be the one that isn't talked about. We don't hear anything about Christian phobia, although there is a lot of that around. But it may well be that people are drawn to Christianity for that reason, and that it gives them an identity and a way of pushing back against, the rise of Islam. So we'll see.
But can I also say that we're going to see at the next election an even greater decline in the quality of MP in Parliament. I mean, if people think that the MPs that they have now are a rum lot, just wait to see what happens after the 4th of July. Not just with the Labour Party, but also with all the other parties, even the Conservative Party, where we know that they are actually also prioritising virtue signalling, ethnic diversity over excellence and competence. I mean, a very good friend of mine was shortlisted to be a parliamentary candidate for the Tory party, and they were supported by their local constituency. They had all of the backing of several people, senior people in the Conservative Party. It was a shoo-in, and then they were told they're not going to have it, and instead parachuted in was a member of an ethnic minority community whose English was left a lot to be desired, was not very articulate in any way whatsoever, could barely string a sentence together. That's the Conservative Party.
Really?
And and if you look at the Labour Party, I mean, because of the box ticking that goes on there, I mean, it's quite clear. We can see it already in Parliament. People who don't have a grasp of the English language, who are clearly there not because of their excellence or competence, but because of who they are and what they represent. And that's going to lead to a great decline, I think, in the quality of debate, discussion, and analysis of legislation, and the ability to represent and also to relate to your constituents. If you can't speak the language, how are you going to be able to actually communicate or understand the causes and issues that they come to you with?
I mean, you're actually sort of seeing in certain parts on the right as well, increasing calls for foreign-born people are not to be allowed to stand. I mean, I've seen that one, for example. I don't know whether you have. But, I mean, things that would have been unthinkable a while ago. But I mean, it must be a response to this kind of thing, actually.
Yeah, I think things are getting more extreme, things are getting more polarised because people just don't know what to do about this issue. So then they reach to the more extreme response because what else do you do?
Yes, yeah. It does. It's interesting, because it's interesting. I've just been down in Clacton, which is where Nigel Farage obviously is standing, and we filmed a little bit for the channel. Will be on soon, and what came over from those people was that. What is it about Nigel that we asked a few people at the pub? What is it about Nigel that they support? And they said, well, they don't really follow politics, but Nigel basically cares about the British people, and all of the others care about, as they put it, foreigners. And I mean, it was just quite an authentic response. It just came out there time and time again. And it does appear, doesn't it? I mean, this is a Tory party you're talking about with your friend. I mean, what is the attitude of, say, like someone who's worked so hard to become an MP? What should they do? Why would they even have any faith anymore in actually that party?
Yeah, well, because they are so loyal, and it's so difficult to abandon such a long connection. But there's always this hope, of the Praetorian Guard of the Tory party that they will be involved in refashioning and reforming it after this cataclysmic existential crisis that they're facing. And of course, those people who are on our side in the Tory party, those people who are on the right of the Tory party, have been calling for people to be giving the message that Nigel Farage has given. I mean, none of this is complicated. None of this is rocket science. In order to connect with the people, you need to speak simply and effectively and emotionally. And all that Sunak has done is talk about tax. Labour will increase your taxes and so forth. They called this election, because inflation was at a certain level, a complete reluctance to discuss immigration and culture and so forth. Of course, to a degree, you can understand why, because they've ballsed up the entire issue of immigration for the last 14 years. So they know that they're on shaky ground, but still the inability to connect with the people on that sort of human level, as Nigel can do, That's clearly why you can see this disconnect between the Tory establishment and the people who once voted Tory.
And also, it's just economics again. Are people? Is inflation even an issue for people? I don't mean to be complacent there, but I don't think it's the sort of thing that's going to get people up.
No.
That's it. I'm going to go and vote.
No, I think they're just playing it safe. I think this has been an absolutely appalling campaign from the Tory party. I mean, it's been unbelievable. Just from one worst thing to the next, you couldn't make it up in some ways. And I do think that Rishi Sunak, he doesn't. I've never felt that with him, that he connects with the British public. I mean, I think it is because he is. He's very, very wealthy, and he's himself a Hindu, and most people can't relate to that. He is, and I think all this issue with D-Day, whether he meant it or not, it did come across like he doesn't really understand our traditions or our history, whether he does or not. Privately, I don't know, but I think that he just absolutely has not connected with the people, and I think this campaign that has really come through, that he just has no disconnect.
Yes,
connection.
it's also just, I think that's a technocratic thing. I think, I can think of a lot of other people, not Rishi Sunak, who would be exactly the same in that situation. But yes, it's still to say deadly dull. What is the impression I've been left with is that when something is really in decline, that's when sheer incompetence comes out in, say, like campaigning. They just get everything wrong. I mean, if you go back to that terrible kind of meme they put out, it was before the election, admittedly, where it had Sunak and the King and what would have been Concord once, but no longer was. Do you remember? And it was all, don't speak Britain down. And you sort of think, you don't even believe anything you're even sort of saying, or.
No, and he went out and did that speech in the rain, and then he went to the place where the Titanic was built, and obviously everybody had a good laugh.
The Titanic.
Then he put out, sinking ship. I mean, people were already saying it's like changing the deck chairs on the Titanic before that event.
Yeah.
It was quite incredible. And then he put out some strange TikTok video, and then he had the national service policy. And I think now it feels like, apart from these TV debates, he's sort of gone a bit quiet, because I think he probably knows it's best just to stay out of the limelight now.
Yes.
But it just goes to show the lack of political acumen amongst people who are the leaders of this country now. This is the great dilemma that we're facing. And yeah, and you're right, it's not just Rishi Sunak. His advisors, James Forsyth, who was once lauded as one of the great experts on conservative politics, long-time columnist for The Spectator, he and Liam Booth-Smith are the two right-hand men to Rishi Sunak. And they were the ones who were saying, oh no, it's more important to go to ITV and do a silly interview, which is going out in a few days, rather than just stay 3 or 4 more hours at Normandy. Because they live in a very different bubble. For them, they are political anoraks, and everything about them is about the Westminster bubble, what's happening there. The public as a whole have no idea or interest in what's going on in the corridors of Westminster. Things like D-Day do count, and it's that inability of them to see that. And it's because they're so inexperienced. Prime ministers used to be people who had been in Parliament for 10, 20, 30, for decades or whatever, had served in other great offices of state. What has Rishi Sunak done? He was Chancellor for a little bit, but he doesn't have a great history in Parliament. He was only elected a few years ago, and yet we're entrusting increasingly to people like this with the reins of power over the country.
Actually, yes. Although some people in the Tory side are sort of saying this all, it was terrible that they even put him there, and the whole rot set in with getting rid of Boris. I mean, I'm sorry, but to me it seems incredibly sort of to misunderstand the situation.
I think if that was the case, then they could have just bring Boris back and get all the votes, but they've not done that because the Red Wall have been let down by Boris.
Yeah.
Everybody, I think a lot of people feel let down by Boris on immigration and on lockdown and lots of things. So I think that shtick of him being kind of Churchillian is over. Nobody trusts him anymore.
No. One thing as well that I just wanted to talk about was, the public are looking at this election campaign and they're being, confronted with discussions about tax or whatever it might be, But essentially, the way in which Labour might change things is much more difficult actually for people to grasp, because it's very much this legal. I mean, there was an article in The Spectator this week talking about how Starmer will effectively basically it'll be ruled by lawyers, basically.
Yeah, I mean, this is something obviously that happened under Blair, and David Starkey's doing a very good job of articulating this on the lecture he did for New Cultural Forum, kind of explains it. But obviously Blair brought in the Supreme Court and the Equalities Act. He put on a lot of legislation which, even after 14 years of Tory rule, was not undone. The Tories just accepted it. And it seems as though Starmer will continue in that Blairite tradition of embedding power through the courts, essentially. I mean, Starmer is a former lawyer, like Tony Blair, former director of public prosecution, and we know that he has form on this. When he was the director of public prosecution, he essentially pushed through guidelines that effectively changed the laws, liberalised euthanasia laws, essentially without any democratic mandate to do so. Didn't prosecute when he should have done in relation to abortion cases, made his own mind up. So he's someone that's very much willing to get his own way and essentially dismiss the sovereignty of Parliament and the democratic vote through law, and it is becoming this kind of unseen, unknowable authority, just the law that nobody knows how to challenge, and even Parliament's unable to do so. And it's terrifying, because this is what the Tory government should have challenged, and now they've lost the opportunity to do so, and it's only going to get worse.
It's actually part of a broader thing, isn't it, really, Rafe, that as well, of basically the seeping away from the Commons of power, actually, to quangos. And so I'm thinking of, for example, the climate quango. What is it actually called? The Climate Change Committee? Yeah. This is a body that is just appointed. It's not, you and I didn't elect it, and yet it has this enormous power.
Yeah, I mean, some people are saying, well, this is going to be phase 2 of the Blair Revolution starting. Well, actually, the Blair Revolution never stopped. It continued under the Tories. So this is just a continuation. It's going to be put onto steroids now that that Labour is likely to have a supermajority. But you're quite right. The entire Blair project, it has been about taking power away from Parliament, vesting power firstly in the executive, in the Prime Minister himself, and then also by creating these quangos, which are unaccountable to the public, unaccountable to Parliament, and yet they have a great sway over crucial issues, be it the economy, be it immigration, be it climate change. These have now been sort of franchised out to unelected, unaccountable bodies. It all started, of course, when Tony Blair went away from cabinet government, which Thatcher was the great believer in consensus around the cabinet table, and we had sofa government. That sofa at number 10 Downing Street with Alistair Campbell, Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair, and the ability of Parliament to hold the government to account, or to hold for members of their own party to hold cabinet to account has gone. And that's why Blair brought in a sort of a presidential style prime ministerial politics, and then this whole emanation of power away from the government and away from the people. And what we're going to see is when the courts now become empowered to actually hold the government in check. And we've seen the Tory government tied up in knots because of the Equality Act, because of the Human Rights Act, because of the ECHR, unable to send off a single plane to Rwanda after 4 years when we have a sovereign parliament. I mean, clearly we don't have a sovereign parliament if it's not able to actually send one plane off to Rwanda after 4 years. Rishi Sunak may not be in this bad a position had planes been departing for the last 3 years to Rwanda. And of course, the great crime and tragedy, we've been on this channel since 2019, I think, and we've been saying one act of Parliament is all that it requires to repeal the Equality Act, repeal the Human Rights Act, and the fact that the Tory government hasn't done it is scandalous and shameful, but they're now actually reaping the downsides of all of that.
Yeah, actually, I know this might sound rather a sort of fanciful point, but do you think that this kind of thing has all been exposed because we left the EU? I mean, it's exposed the framework of how our government is actually working. So much could be blamed before. on the EU in an odd way.
It's a good point, because now we still feel like we don't have control, but we can't blame it on a foreign or overseas court.
Yeah.
It's because of our court here. So yeah, in a way, but I don't know if people are fully aware of what Starmer's going to do, but he is going to add, he's going to add to the Equalities Act. He wants to add socioeconomic status or class to the Equalities Act as a protected characteristic.
Sorry, this is important, isn't it?
Yeah, and potentially why stop there? If he's already talking about adding in a protected characteristic, there'll be more pressure from other groups to add in more and more protected characteristics. So essentially, rather than undoing the Equality Act, which a lot of us would want, he's going to add to it, and he's also going to bring in a Race Equality Act on top of the Equality Act, even though race is already covered by the Equality Act, which will function a bit like the Gender Equality Act, which is like to allow for gender pay to be the same. But this is expanded. With all of these laws, they expand because the language becomes more and more subjective and open to interpretation. So with the gender pay gap, as it was described, it was unlawful to pay a man and a woman different sum of money for the same work. But then it expanded to include work of equal value. Well, how do you define whether work is of equal value? And now Starmer wants to bring this in relation to race. So, for example, there was a case in I believe it was Birmingham, where essentially women who were cleaners were arguing that they should be paid the same as men that were dustbin cleaners, and they won that case. So you can have people doing different jobs essentially arguing that they should be paid the same, and that will happen along race lines, which means we are going to become more and more divided, in terms of race and identity lines, which we already are. But laws like this are just going to do the opposite of what they're supposed to do, in that they will not bring about equality. They'll bring about affirmative action, they'll bring about resentment, they'll bring about everybody becoming overly aware of their identity and their rights in relation to their identities.
And this is all happening at a time when the economy has never been in a worse strait, where this country is facing, economic stagnation. Birmingham Council went bankrupt because it wasn't able to actually pay these increased, payouts to women. And now they want to basically expand that to the entire nation and have the nation therefore responsible for paying out all of these future race pay inequities and all the rest of it, which is going to cost potentially, tens of billions of pounds. I mean, it's sheer lunacy.
Is it? Do you get a sense, a sort of an ominous sense? I mean, maybe it's because I'm too wrapped up in this all the time, but I did this week. I suddenly sort of thought, do we truly appreciate what we're facing, actually? I mean, people have been talking about a one-party state, but of course it does feel like that, because alongside what we've just been discussing, you've also got to look at everything. All the other institutions are peopled by staff who essentially go along with the Labour Party. It's all part of the same thing. Labour Party, I think, as Starkey put it, is the sort of, it's the parliamentary political party wing of the blob, same thing.
Yeah,
this is one-party state.
Yeah, I think it is. It's going to become more tyrannical, and I think it's going to become more rigid than it was under Blair. And I think people are more demoralised now because, there was hope with Brexit, and there was hope with the 80-seat majority and the Conservative government, and we don't even have that now. So unless kind of reform of some of these emergent political parties take sway, I think people are just going to I'm feeling it almost, that I'm just sort of accepting that that we're going to be living in tyranny. I'm just sort of thinking, it is going to be. We aren't going to have any kind of real democracy. We aren't going to be able to challenge these institutions or the law, and you've just got to sort of work out how to function within that framework, essentially.
Well, this is the point. The other way is you try and take a longer perspective. And I remember, famously Churchill sort of, jumped the shark in our language, didn't he, in 1945 when he said it would require a Gestapo to basically enforce what Labour wanted to do. So I sort of think about it and I think, well, maybe some of this is hyperbole. But then when you look at all the things we talk about all the time in all parts of our state, you sort of think, actually, it's not hyperbole.
Yeah, I mean, Churchill was ridiculed for using Gestapo when, Clement Attlee was the most sort of mild-mannered, meek person you could imagine. But I'm sorry, we may not have a Gestapo on the streets, but, one might say a Stasi, certainly. Or, when you look at the degree with which we have two-tier policing, we have people being, imprisoned and charged and arrested and convicted for tweets and so forth. the stifling newspeak that exists, being forced to use compelled speech. We are living in that sort of a dystopian future. 1984 was actually just 30 years too early. It's 2024 when actually we're going to actually see that sort of a world coming to pass in this country. And I think we should all be worried about it. We're in the foothills of a disaster. It's going to be a long, cold winter. And I think spring is perhaps 15, 20, 25 years away. I think so many people I've spoken to talk about this being a 5-year parliament. I'm sorry. When we're talking about a 200-odd seat majority minimum, that takes minimum 10 years, maybe 15 years to erode that. The only reason that Boris Johnson has lost, or the Tories have lost this 80-seat majority was because of COVID, right? COVID was the main thing. Had it not been for COVID, Boris would still be Prime Minister, and I think their poll ratings will be much higher, despite immigration and everything else. COVID blindsided everything. Now, that's a once-in-a-century event. I don't see, who knows what's going to be in the next 15 years, but I doubt we're going to have another COVID-type experience. And so I think we have to expect... there's a new red dawn, and it's not a pleasant one.
I suppose that one will have to look outwards to Europe and possibly to America to kind of take encouragement, because let's face it, the point's been made many times. We're a real outlier, aren't we? I mean, when you look at what's happening in the rest of the world.
It's a reverse of Lord Grey on the eve of the First World War. He said the lights are going out all over Europe.
Yes.
We may not see them lit again in our lifetimes. Well, actually, the lights are flickering in Europe. They've come back in places like France and Germany, and it's in Britain, unfortunately, that the lights are going out.
I think this is why, this sounds like a very long, I don't mean it to sound like an election broadcast, but I can understand why people have gripped on to reform. I really can. As I say, this is at least possibly a foothold,
Yeah, Farage is saying all the right things. He's talking more and more about immigration than he has done before. And people know him. People know that he has to, he's stable. But people know, he hasn't just come out of nowhere like Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss. People have, been on a journey with Nigel Farage. They know what he stands for. They know that they know what he thinks. They know what his instincts are. And he's very likeable. He's very good at what he does. And Reform I think they've led a very good campaign. In comparison to the Tories, and it would be very interesting to see what happens. But he's projected to win Clacton, so it'll be the first time he's won, and to see him as an MP will be very interesting. And that is the one positive I think in all of this.
I mean, you were in Clacton today.
Yes, that's right.
And with Nigel, how was it?
No, Nigel was elsewhere, but he's going to be there tomorrow. This would be on Sunday, so this is going out Saturday. Fine. I mean, as I think I said earlier, there's no question about it. People sort of feel he is on their side, which is what you're saying. They feel instinctively like they did with Thatcher. Thatcher had that in a completely different way, but that people felt instinctively, oh no, she's my type. She will fight for Britain. And there were we met people who'd come up, like just this married couple, who'd come up from the West Country just simply to canvass for him. They weren't anyone in the party or anything like that. So, I don't think any other party would really have that kind of devotion. I mean, I do understand why people feel the way they do about reform. Just by way of ending, 2 issues that have hardly been mentioned in this campaign, you would think they would have been. What are they? COVID, right?
Oh, yeah.
You've just mentioned COVID.
Yeah.
How we handled COVID, right? And Brexit, actually. Mm-hmm. Now, isn't it interesting? COVID, you would think they would be talking and they would be drawing conclusions, wouldn't they? Because it's all happened in the past, 5 years or whatever. And nothing. It's like they're all embarrassed, fed up or whatever by what happened, what they did.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the biggest thing that we've lived through,
yes.
As a country in terms of our rights and our freedoms.
Yeah.
And so many tragedies happened, and so much of our economy was affected. Everything was affected. Schooling, mental health, the NHS, everything was affected by it. And it's almost like it's not in any of their interest to talk about it. And there is just this collective amnesia about it, which I find so strange, because it's something that we should all be thinking about going forward. It's a huge event that we haven't really properly had any conclusion to. The COVID inquiry is a complete farce. But it's very odd that it's just been forgotten. And I think it's almost as though, I think some of the people are embarrassed by it. I think people now, it is now largely come through that a lot of, our way of thinking about it was correct, that there was a lot of push to do things that we shouldn't have been doing, that a lot of the evidence shows that we didn't need as such stringent rules, and we didn't, the vaccine's proven to be not as strong as it was, and things are coming through about vaccine harms and so on. And I think there's almost this, there's this alliance between people that's unsaid, that it's just better off not to talk about it.
Certainly I get the impression amongst politicians. I mean, because if you think about it, in some ways it sums up this kind of, just the uni party, as some people call them, that on the one hand, it's best not if they talk about Brexit, because they've both got things to lose on that. And similarly with COVID.
On Brexit and on COVID, exactly. It's a pox on all their houses. Yeah. And they know that it's not a winning formula, because there is such great resentment amongst the British people on both grounds, that simply to remind people of that is actually, works against your own interest. I mean, the Tories do mention COVID only as a defence to NHS waiting lists and GP appointments. They think, oh, well, this is because of the COVID backlog. What they should be saying is, we're terribly sorry, we locked down. That's why, it's not COVID, it's lockdown that caused this, and they keep blaming it on COVID. No, it was your lockdown policies that actually created the situation that we're having now. It was your lockdown policies that have destroyed our children's education. It is, it is a lockdown policies that have decimated high streets in every major city, where people are now working from home on Mondays and Fridays and so forth. And so many businesses have gone under. Small businesses, which are the backbone of Britain, are actually small businesses, and they took the brunt of lockdown, not of COVID. And I think, any reminder of that actually works against the Tories' interests.
Well, look, I mean, we will be here, won't we, to go through it with you. We're not going anywhere. But to be continued just for another couple of weeks, actually effectively one more news speak before the election on the 4th. Amy, thank you very much. Rafe, thank you very much. And thank you for watching. And do remember that date, 25th of June, in either Wellingborough or Newcastle. Okay? Thank you. Have a good week. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.